females.
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, the only people who are capable of being pregnant are biological females, and therefore I think federal pregnancy programs should be limited to biological females, and that's what this would do.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington State is recognized.
Mr. President, let's be clear about what's going on here. This is a procedural attempt by Republicans to derail our ability to get this bill across the finish line and deliver for families in our countries. You know, it's actually outrageous that Republicans are trying to talk about pregnancy when in this country right now, they are forcing women to stay pregnant no matter their circumstances, pushing cruel and extreme abortion bans. Republicans are now resorting to tactics like this to distract from the fact that they don't have any serious concerns for working so hard to oppose this bill that lowers costs, lowers emissions, and lowers the deficit. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
My time remaining?
Senator from Florida has 40 seconds.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. A few minutes ago, I looked back across 5,500 years of human history. So far, every single pregnancy has been a biological female. And so therefore, the only thing I'm trying to do is make sure that federal law is clear that since every pregnancy that's ever existed has been in a biological female, that our federal laws reflect that, and our pregnancy programs are available to the only people who are capable of getting pregnant, biological females. Very simple. I would accept a unanimous consent if they want to offer it, and we can move on and not waste any time.
Senator Murray has 10 seconds left.
When we are facing the challenges we do in this country, when we're facing challenges in this country and helping our constituents to lower costs, it is outrageous that Republicans are trying to define pregnancy, of all things, on this floor, on this day, after hours of voting on amendments. I urge a no vote.
Questions on the motion?
As for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Rosen, Feinstein. Yes. Sorry, I have you. Thank you. Yes. Ron, Daines. Yes. Yes. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown. I got you. Mr. Haggerty, I got you. Murray, Smith, Merkley, Heinrich, Menendez. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, I did, thank you. Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, thank you. Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Langford, Lee, Marshall, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Klobuchar, Lujan, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Kelly, no. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Casey, no. Ms. Sinema, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. No, he didn't. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Just- oh, wait. Mr. Schatz, no.
The yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The motion is not agreed to. The senior senator from South